Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with House Democrats releasing incriminating emails from Epstein expressing surprise that Trump has not been tied to his and Maxwell's sex trafficking victims, one of whom Epstein said Trump spent hours with at his house, while going on to describe Trump in a 2018 email to Larry Summers as borderline insane. In response, Republicans on the House Oversight Committee just released 23,000 pages of documents from the Epstein estate. We will discuss how the real smoking gun yet to be fired is Epstein's ties to Israeli intelligence. Is Nina Burleigh, a senior editor at the New Republic, best-selling author, documentary producer, and publisher of the Substack American Freak Show. A professor at New York University's Arthur J. Carter Journalism Institute. She's written 7 books, the latest of which include Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women, and she has a new novel, Zero Visibility Possible. She's the producer of a documentary series on Apple TV, Epstein's Shadow. Then we'll look into the migration of big tech from Silicon Valley to Texas, where the demand for electricity from giant AI and crypto server farms is driving up electricity prices for Texans, as well as the fusion of techno-fascism and Christo-fascism, with Elon Musk's monarcho-capitalism embracing the Christian nationalism of Petro-Baptists. Joining us is Fred Turner, the Harry and Norman Chandler Professor of Communication at Stanford University. He's the author or co-author of 5 books, including Seeing Silicon Valley, Life Inside a Fraying America, and From Counterculture to Cyberculture, Stewart Brand, The Whole Earth Network, and the Rise of Digital Utopianism. And he has an article at the Buffalo we will discuss, The Texan Ideology, Silicon Valley Looks for Lebensraum in the Bible Belt. Then finally, we'll assess the new poll that finds GOP voters are most likely to call Trump tough, intelligent, or a peacemaker, while Democrats and independents say he's destructive, erratic, or reckless. Joining us is Jonathan Geyer, Program Director at the Institute for Global Affairs at the Eurasia Group, a reporter and editor focused on foreign policy, national security in the Middle East. He is an Arabic and Hebrew speaker and spent 5 years as a correspondent in Egypt. He is a regular contributor at the New Republic, New York Magazine, The Guardian, among others, and is the co-author of a new study at the Eurasia Group we will discuss, Reckless Peacemaker, How Americans See Trump's Foreign Policy. And before we begin with our tax dollars paying for the bombing of innocents abroad and racist thuggery at home, as families are ripped apart and neighbors disappeared from our streets, shops, and schools, we find ourselves at a moral moment when America's better angels have to be mobilized against a cruel and corrupt regime enabled by political cowardice and judicial blindness. The only way to save our democracy from its current descent into fascism is a massive mobilization of people power against a plutocratic-funded 2026 Trump campaign of voter suppression and intimidation by masked government thugs. As Trump cowers the owners of the press and defunds public broadcasting, Background Briefing needs your support to keep providing a reality-based daily briefing that exposes the regime's malevolent machinations to protect and defend our constitutional rights and freedom of speech and assembly. We ask you to make a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at our foundation, publictruthmedia.org, and thank you for defending the home of the brave and the land of the free. And joining us now, Nina Burleigh, who's a senior editor of the New Republic, best-selling author, documentary producer, and publisher of the Substack American Freak Show, a professor at New York University's Arthur J. Carter Journalism Institute. She's written 7 books, the latest of which include Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women, and she has a new novel, Zero Visibility Possible, and she's the producer of a documentary series on Apple TV, Epstein's Shadow. Welcome to Background Briefing, Nina Burleigh.
Thank you.
So, Nina, there's quite a bit of news breaking on the Epstein story, which you've been doggedly following for decades. And it seems that the House Oversight Committee, the Democrats on the House Oversight Committee, have a pipeline into the Epstein estate, and they've managed to get some very incriminating emails that Epstein sent both to Ghislaine Maxwell and to the writer Wolf, who is apparently sitting on loads and loads, hundreds of hours of interviews with Epstein, which I don't understand why they can't be made public. So, what do you make of what's happening today? And of course, it's happening on a day that the House is finally opened after 7 weeks, where Mike Johnson shut down the House as a favor to Trump to avoid the Epstein files being released. But now they've had to seat the Democratic Congresswoman who will be the 218th vote on the discharge petition, which would break the logjam on releasing the Epstein files, even though that's not going to happen fast or even possibly. So let's start with today's breaking news. What do you make of it?
Well, it's the House Oversight Committee releasing a few of the, I don't know how many motherload of emails that they got and material they got from the Epstein estate. And they show Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell chit-chatting about Donald Trump in what Epstein says, that's the dog that doesn't bark, about Trump. And it's after he's gotten in trouble, and they're chit-chatting about how Trump, clearly knew what they were up to with the girls. And in fact, according to Ghislaine or Epstein, he was in the house for hours with redacted victim, which it turns out is, at least according to the Republican Oversight Committee members released, that it was Virginia Giuffre that they're referring to, that they've blacked out in that email. So what's happening now? As you said, the Arizona Democrat will be seated. The discharge petition is going to come fast and hard, and I think you're going to see, and you are seeing, an avalanche now. It's the gates are open now. You see, not just this, but this email. This is one. The ones today are just a bit of the Epstein estate material that the House Oversight has its hands on, and there's other material come out, and people putting together information, like Ryan Grimm and his associate there at Dropsite News, who've been doing incredible work taking these hacked emails of Ehud Barak, which have been out in the public domain for months, but basically ignored by the mainstream media. And we've been picking through them, as have a lot of people. But these guys over at Dropsite News have done incredible work taking those emails and putting between Epstein and Ehud Barak and putting them into a kind of a timeline with other things that were going on in American foreign policy and Israeli activity and things that were going on in the Middle East. And I think they're on their fourth installment of showing the relationship between Ehud Barak and Epstein, and how that relationship and how these emails between these two men, who clearly were not just buddies but in business together, were really engaged in a lot of influencing, at the very least, influence operation. And if this week's issue is to be believed, actual spy activity with drop sites in like an Apple store in New York City or something. So putting all of that together, what you're seeing, I think, is, and I don't know if the mainstream media is ever going to pick up on this, but I think, as most people have thought for a long time, but now I think it's undeniable that Epstein was engaged with Israeli intelligence and operating with at these high levels of American influence to advance the interests of Ehud Barak and the Mossad.
Well, the latest piece by Ryan Grimm and Murtaza Hussain at Dropsite News is Epstein and Israel. Israeli spy stayed for weeks at a time with Jeffrey Epstein in Manhattan. And as you pointed out, this has not been covered by the mainstream media. However, Trump's former lawyer from his first term, Ty Cobb, was on CNN the other day, and he was asked about the significance of the Arizona congresswoman being seated and therefore the discharge petition happening, and what would the files reveal and he didn't think there would be much coming from what the House endeavor is because it's going to take a while. The Senate's got to get involved, and God knows when it would be released. But he said, Ty Cobb, that the real action is at the CIA. That's where the real smoking gun is. And he went on to say that Robert Maxwell, who's clearly had ties to Mossad and who was buried in a place of honor in Israel, he essentially handed over his Mossad and KGB contacts to via his daughter Ghislaine to Epstein. So Epstein inherited the Robert Maxwell portfolio, and that is unbelievably explosive.
I didn't know that Ty Cobb said that on television. When we worked on the Ghislaine Maxwell three-part documentary, we had heard that and basically pretty much surmised that that was the case. But you can't, the people who are telling us these things are, they've been attacked and discredited, and now one of them's dead. So I don't know where Ty Cobb's getting that information, but we definitely had heard that the whole Epstein Ghislaine Maxwell thing begins in London with Robert Maxwell, kind of anointing him as his replacement.
Well, that would indicate that the CIA is at least what Ty Cobb's saying, that the CIA has the real stuff, the explosive stuff, but we don't know whether or not it still exists, right? We don't
Right.
know
I mean, I
what.
don't know what is more explosive. I mean, these articles that have been put out by Ryan Grimm and Drop Site are, if they were on the front page of the Times, would be explosive, right? I mean, they're based in fact. So, and the emails, the amount of interaction between Ehud Barak and Epstein for years, their interactions. I mean, there's the interaction with Putin between the two of them. They are, messing about in, Syrian affairs, the whole gas, remember the nerve gas thing with the the Syrian government supposedly nerve gassed, and then there was this like response, well, maybe it was a false flag to get the Americans because it was a crossing of the red line. You see Ehud Barak and Epstein back and forth over that. While Ehud Barak ought to write another op-ed, they were editing an op-ed for the New York Times that Ehud Barak was going to put his name on that would say, how much longer are we going to wait before we bomb Iran, before the U.S. bombs Iran? And, the just nonstop interaction between these guys. It's all in these emails that were hacked. And I guess, these big papers, the big companies are now, I don't know, they certainly didn't mind picking through the hacked emails of Hillary Clinton in 2016 and Podesta. But maybe they have some kind of rule now that they don't look at those things. I don't know. I don't work there. But
Right.
it's incredible that the mainstream media is ignoring this because that whether or not the CIA has material, there is a lot of material out there. And again, as I said, I think the avalanche is going to start coming out. Just 2 days ago, there was there's the story that we have that Ghislaine Maxwell took one of Epstein's trafficked girls, young women, who was a teen. She was a British model, teen, who had spent several years being raped and trafficked by Epstein, and who went on Dateline and said that she was like after Epstein died, she was among a bunch of girls who went on television and said, "Yeah, he was doing this to me." Well, we found documents in newspaper articles that talk about Ghislaine Maxwell took this young woman after she left Florida after the period of 3 years of being groomed and raped by Epstein, introduces her to Trump in New York. And it's covered in like the British tabloids, like, oh, a hot new model that has caught the eye of a billionaire in New York City, and talks about how Trump moved her into his building, gave her an apartment. And we were always wondering, when is this girl going to talk about the Trump connection? And she just did. 2 days ago, she went on live TV and said, yeah, Ghislaine Maxwell, introduced me to him, and Ghislaine made it clear to him that I had been Epstein's one of Epstein's pets or, you know, victims. So I think stuff like that is going to start coming out. I think also that, uh, Jamie Raskin, congressman from Maryland, recently sent a letter to Pam Bondi asking her about reports from the SDNY, the district, the federal prosecutors in Manhattan, that they were actively still investigating Epstein in 2024 and in 2025, in January of 2025. So literally Trump gets inaugurated. And literally at that point, the Pam Bondi and the Justice Department tell the Manhattan DA, Manhattan feds, to turn over the material and shut it down. I think that is an incredible coincidence. And I think that more needs to be made of it.
Sure.
Raskin wrote the letter last week. Maybe it was buried in because of the shutdown. People didn't cover. But again, the fact that they shut the investigation down the minute they got in there, and then they took the material to Washington, and they've now flagged it all we know that they put, these FBI agents on duty to flag Trump's name and put it in some kind of spreadsheet. And so I don't know that even if the House oversight or the House itself votes to get all that stuff out of the Justice Department, who knows whether they're actually going to see whatever it was.
Right.
So the only hope is really to get it from like this Epstein estate, or maybe there's stuff down at the U.S. Virgin Islands case with J.P. Morgan. I don't know, but I don't know that they're going to, if they've put that many agents on it, but the fact that they would shut down the investigation at that point in time, per Jamie Raskin's letter, is mind-boggling.
But not surprising. And in fact, I talked to some Intel people, ex-CIA, that said that they thought that the first thing that Trump did in January when he took over was to have all that evidence that the CIA had destroyed. But presumably, and so there's some suggestion that people inside the so-called deep state made copies. So something may surface there. But just to finish up on Epstein and the Israelis, the point is about inheriting the KGB and the Mossad file from Robert Maxwell. Epstein, his value to both the Russians and the Israelis was the compromat, right? The honey traps, the blackmail that he had on all of these powerful people.
Sure, absolutely. He was always, I mean, that's what he was. That's what he was doing. It was a blackmail factory.
Right,
It was a compromat factory. And that's why there was you can never be sure that he wasn't just that he was just working for the one side, right? Because Maxwell, Robert Maxwell actually was like a triple spy. I mean, he was involved in the October surprise stuff with Iran and getting promise into Russia, the surveillance material that, the surveillance program that the CIA wanted to get into Russia. So he worked for like different, he was helping get Soviet Jews into Israel. So he had to work with the
mm,
KGB. And that's this kind of job that people like that have where they're
right,
like one rung below. They're engaged in intelligence, but they're not like actually on the payroll. I don't know what you call them. I know
right,
Greg Olear, and those guys call them the Rocketeers. I don't know if you
right.
can say it on radio. Uh,
Well, the Ryan Grimm articles also indicate Ehud Barak working with Epstein and the Israeli spy that Epstein had holed up at his apartment in Manhattan for a long time. They met with Larry Ellison, and,
yes.
and Larry Ellison had, when he got started, Oracle got started on a CIA contract with stolen Russian software. So there's
It
an
all
interesting
comes
story.
full circle. And now he runs one of the major networks. Well, his son owns the major network in the US and puts Barry Weiss in charge of it.
Right.
Apologist for genocide.
Right. So just in the last minute, though, we need to go back to the revelations today of Epstein's emails to Ghislaine Maxwell and to the author Michael Wolff, who was sitting on a ton of material, which I don't understand why that can't be released. But in any case, in April of 2011, Epstein wrote to Maxwell saying that I want you to realize that the dog that hasn't barked is Trump. And then he went on to say that, and it turns out to be Gouffre, spent hours at my house with him. He has never once been mentioned. And then she writes back, Maxwell writes back, I have been thinking about that. Isn't that an interesting contrast to Maxwell's deposition with the Deputy Attorney General, former Trump defense lawyer, where she talked about Trump being a perfect gentleman? She knew all about this,
Oh,
basically saying,
oh, absolutely.
how come Trump's escaped scrutiny? That's what they're talking about.
Absolutely. She is a complete and utter liar. And that's the other piece of news that's come out that the way she's being treated down there, preparing herself to get a commutation. Basically, that prison is like, the Bureau of Prisons has set up the Hotel Creole for her down there. I mean, it's, the relatives get to come in, they bring snacks, they gave her Wi-Fi. It's unbelievable. And yeah, she's lying. And the record, the emails, I'm sure Trump will just say those are fake emails or something, and they'll just keep bulldozing on. But we know.
But what's just in closing, though, what does it mean here when Epstein, in an email in 2019, where he claimed that Trump knew about the girls, and he asked Maxwell to stop? What does that
Yes.
mean?
What
What?
what we read that as meaning stop stealing my girls. Stop stealing girls from Mar-a-Lago. Stop poaching babes from Mar-a-Lago. That's what that means.
So he's telling Maxwell to tell Trump to stop stealing girls like he did
No,
with.
the other way around. No, it's that's what they're, she says he says he told Ghislaine to stop. He means Trump told Ghislaine to stop. That's what that email is. And Trump told Ghislaine to stop taking girls from Mar-a-Lago. That's how I read it.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, there's obviously a lot more to learn, and I appreciate you joining us here today, Nina Burleigh.
Anytime.
And again, I've been speaking with Nina Burleigh, who's a senior editor of the New Republic, best-selling author, documentary producer, and publisher of the Substack American Freak Show, a professor at New York University's Arthur J. Carter Journalism Institute. She's written 7 books, the latest of which include Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women, and she has a new novel, Zero Visibility Possible, and is the producer of a documentary series on Apple TV, Epstein's Shadow. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into the fusion of techno-fascism and Christo-fascism with Elon Musk's Monaco capitalism embracing the Christian nationalism of Petro-Baptists.
Mirrors, smoke, screens, and lies. It's not the politicians, but the actions I despise. You and Saddam should kick it like back in the day with the cocaine and Cavassier.
Would you build more bombs as we get more bold as your midlife crisis war unfolds? All you wanna do is take control and put that access to evil bullshit on hold.
Now, citizen rule number 2080. Politicians are shady. So people watch your back because they think they smoke crack. I don't doubt it. Look at how they act.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Fred Turner, the Harry and Norman Chandler Professor of Communication at Stanford University. He's the author or co-author of 5 books, including Seeing Silicon Valley, Life Inside a Fraying America, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, Stewart Brand, The Whole Earth Network, and The Rise of Digital Utopianism. And he has an article at the BAFLA, The Texan Ideology, Silicon Valley Looks for Lebensraum in the Bible Belt. Welcome to Background Briefing, Fred Turner.
Hi, Ian. Good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And of course, Lebensraum means, in German, it means living room, which was the call by Hitler and the Nazis, which led to World War II. But
Yeah.
in this case, you're talking about the tech giants like Musk and company moving to Texas, where they've been welcomed and generously hosted. But you're also talking about, in your article, The Baffler, how Silicon Valley's California ideology grew out of the collision of the computer industry and the counterculture, but the Texan ideology reflects a centuries-old fusion of the oil industry and millenarian Christianity. So does that explain what's going on with Peter Thiel lately, where he's doing these lectures on the Book of Revelation? And
Well, I don't think anything can quite explain Peter Thiel's fascination with the Antichrist. I think that's Peter Thiel's idiosyncratic Christianity. But I do think that we're seeing Musk and Joe Lonsdale and other Silicon Valley notables who've gone to Texas speaking toward a kind of Christian style that they might not have done earlier. So Musk, for instance, has a picture on Twitter of himself holding a baby. He looks just like a sort of masculine Mary Magdalene holding a baby Jesus, and he says, in the tweet, I'm not religious, but Jesus Christ was a wise man. Joe Lonsdale, a venture capitalist, has founded a conservative university and has gone out of his way to promote what he calls, Christian Western values, though he is himself a Jewish person. So I think there's a sort of allegiance that people have to swear very gently to that Christian ideology. The deeper point is that we're in this moment of intense transition from networking of the 1990s when we were building out the internet and all of the dreams of the counterculture for interconnection, consciousness connection that seemed to be coming true at that moment, with the new moment of AI, cryptocurrency, where we're really trying to extract value from human systems and natural systems. We've shifted from being a kind of fantasy telephone network to being an oil industry, and the oil is us.
but how is Texas in hosting Musk and these other tech billionaires with their massive AI factories and crypto processing centers, which require enormous amounts of electricity? Ironically, my understanding is that Texas actually, in spite of its right-wing government, has embraced solar and wind, which of course Trump hates, and he shut down everything that Biden did in that regard. So where are they getting their electricity from?
As far as I know, they're getting their electricity from the standard grid, and however the grid is set up is how they get their electricity. You may know that the New York Times reported that the arrival of AI server farms in Texas raised everyone's electricity bill by about 5%. The thing I was trying to point to in the article was not necessarily where they're getting their energy from, though I think they're getting it from all the places we usually do, including fossil fuels. It's more that what they think they're doing and how they justify what they're doing comes from an era of oil extraction. It comes from the 1920s and 1930s. And that was a time when people mining the sort of Texas earth for oil saw themselves as God's agents on earth, literally taking the resources he had given us and turning them into evidence of their own election, their own specialness, all the better to build God's kingdom on earth. That's the kind of logic, the kind of rhetoric, the kind of millenarian utopian vision that Musk and Lonsdale and others are invoking as they move for very practical economic reasons to Texas.
Well, but some of the people that are moving there, like OpenAI, announced the Stargate project. It's a $500 billion 4-year effort to build a series of intellect processing centers, mostly in Texas. They're under construction in Abilene. Feature 10 buildings of 1.5 million square feet each. And then you've got Riot Platforms in Rockdale, Texas, the largest Bitcoin mining operation in North America. 7 buildings, each nearly as long as 3 football fields. And then you got Musk's giant Tesla Gigafactory, which sprawls over 2,500 acres outside of Austin, Texas. They've driven up the electric bills for the average citizen in Texas. But it wasn't long ago that the entire Texas grid crashed. So this feels like an accident waiting to happen.
Oh, I'm quite sure you're right. I think it is an accident waiting to happen. And I think there's another one that we have to be alert to, and that's the question of water. The Gigafactory, Musk's Gigafactory is built right next to the river, I believe it's the Colorado River. And, that factory and AI factories and cryptocurrency factories in general, giant AI server farms, require lots and lots of either energy or water to cool down the work that's being done. And that water comes straight from the land. And Texas is not known for having, extraordinary water resources.
So this new form of techno-theocracy, or the fusion of techno-fascism and Christo-fascism, is what's happening here and what you're writing about in the Baffler. And it's basically how Musk and company moving to Texas are blending the neoliberal economic policies and Christian nationalist cultural ambition rooted in Texas's long history of resource extraction and at ease with racism and misogyny. So that's the match made in heaven, right?
Well, I think it is, and I thank you for quoting the piece. It's an astonishing sort of thing. Not so very long ago, the dream that came out of Silicon Valley was the dream of ubiquitous global networks that served human beings, that helped us connect and helped us create what Marshall McLuhan imagined as, the sort of global village, and it would be a peaceful, happy place. And of course, we know that's not the case. But now we're moving into a new era in which folks who seek the kinds of market control that earlier tech folks did and earlier industries did, like the oil industry, are doing it in collaboration with people who seek a kind of rewriting of America as a religious Christian nation. Someone like Tim Dunn is really important in this story. Tim Dunn is a lesser-known figure. He runs a very large oil drilling company in Texas, and he supports, through his financing, many of the current politicians on the right in Texas. His vision is, as he says, a world in which all of the jobs he does are for God. And we really can't overestimate the power of the religious vision driving the leadership of Texas at this moment. That vision is colliding head on with a vision of the search for market control that has driven the tech industry for a long time and is driving it now to Texas.
Right, but without being too cynical, isn't this all about the fact that the tech industry has done more to increase inequality with now Musk is getting a $1 trillion payday? I mean, what more evidence do you need? And that essentially, not to necessarily quote Karl Marx's religion being the opiate of the masses, but it does feel like they're just throwing a bone to the rubes with expecting Jesus miracles.
Yeah, I don't see religion quite the same way. I think, I see the Christian piece of this as a driving force rather than a mollifying force or a pacifying force. I think, large leaders of large corporations, leaders of states need rationales for what they do. They need legitimating rationales. They need ideologies. And in this case, religion provides a real rationale. If you're a believer, as Tim Dunn certainly is, and as Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, is, you really do believe that you are building God's kingdom on earth, and God put those resources in the land and in the social world for you to mine, extract, and build the new society with. And so, if you're Elon Musk or someone like that who needs a big market share, wants a big market share, it's very easy to start posing, with pictures of your children and, cozying up to that religious vision. I think you had it right earlier when you talked about techno-fascism and kind of Christian nationalism. Those two things come together. We end up in a world of patriarchal control in which difference is erased, in which surveillance is ubiquitous, and in which our natural resources are vacuumed up and put to the work of profit seekers who declare themselves to be the children of God.
Well, I was referring to the prosperity gospel, which is big in Texas with Osteen, and that whole idea that God doesn't want you to be a whiner. God wants you to be a winner, and so that seems to be a big part of this Christo-fascism in terms of what I was suggesting earlier. So you mentioned also, of course, the fact that Silicon Valley is not connecting the world. Mark Zuckerberg, of course, always talked about wanting to connect the world. But Facebook basically is one of the great engines of political conflict, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. And I think connecting, well, so first off, I think connecting the world was a fantasy from the get-go. The idea that once we were all connected, we would live pacifically in these sort of tropical villages, as Marshall McLuhan liked to predict, was nonsense from the get-go. But Facebook has really done a great deal of harm politically. And it's also, I think, and this is one of the challenges for us at this moment, an enormous social mining enterprise. It is an awful lot like an oil conglomerate at the early part of the 20th century, but the oil is in our social world. What it does is it sucks up our social interactions, maps them, and turns them into things that can be sold to other bidders. And that's literally turning our social life that was once perhaps in some ways outside the marketplace into a resource for market exchange. And it requires enormous natural resources. And if it's done in Texas, it requires at least modest fealty to a Christian nationalist vision.
Right, but these petro-Baptists are basically killing the planet. And it would seem to be an unsustainable theology. And at some point or other, the eco-Baptists have to take over.
Well, I love the notion of eco-Baptists, and you're referring to Margaret Atwood and her wonderful trilogy on a kind of post-apocalyptic world. I wish the eco-Baptists would take over. I think the current vision is deeply nihilistic, and it says something like, God's got our backs. We may blow up the planet, but that's okay because God will save us, take us to heaven. You remember that in the early 1980s, something like 30% of Americans believed in the rapture, the notion that God would take his chosen people up to heaven and leave the rest of us to fry. That's a notion that I think is still sort of out there. The idea that if we just have enough faith, we don't need to worry about the end of the planet. The planet was God's creation, and God will take care of those who love Him. That's the most dangerous part of the Christian nationalist vision, in my view, or at least one of them.
Well, Fred, that has not gone away. All you have to do is drive up Highway 5 and listen to Christian broadcasting. And it's all about the rapture and to some extent, that's what Peter Thiel is talking about with the Book of Revelation. And that's the same sick theology that it's almost spiritual pornography, where, you and I, we burn to death in the lake of fire while they all get raptured up to heaven.
Yeah, and I think you're putting your finger here on something that we haven't really got a name for yet. Maybe we should call it Christian nihilism, where we imagine the end times, we imagine that we will survive them, and we take pleasure in the suffering of others. That vision accords very nicely, of course, with the way that Donald Trump runs his country. That he is a master of the theater of cruelty, and he offers the chance to watch that theater to the rest of us as a kind of entertainment. Christian nihilism and Trumpism are very much of a piece, and it's a very dark thing.
So I noticed that the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, was just in Texas on his way down to the COP30 talk in Brazil. He was trolling the Texans. What are the chances of the Democrats taking Texas? I mean, it looks as if the gerrymandering wars, which Texas started at Trump's behest, may not work out that well. They may not get their 5 seats, whereas in California, they may well get their 5 extra seats.
Nothing would delight me more than seeing Texas's gerrymandering fail to produce the Republican majority that Trump seeks. I would be absolutely thrilled. Whether the Democrats can take Texas more generally, I don't know. It's the political machine there is very powerful. It's on the order of Teapot Dome, and I'd be very cautious in thinking that the Democrats could unseat them soon. That said, boy, would it be wonderful if they did, or what?
Right. Well, just in closing, what's the latest on this group out of Silicon Valley, Axe, Acknowledging Christ in Technology? All the top people involved in tech are into this idea of somehow Jesus and Silicon Valley are compatible.
Well, this is news to me. You've just spotted another dark island in the archipelago. I'm not familiar with that group. I'm familiar with probably slightly more secular right-wing actors here. But I'll keep an eye out for them.
Well, they're the group that sponsored and put on Peter Thiel's lecture tour. Look into it. It's really the wife of some of the biggest tech bros there is.
I think that's super important. I will. And one of the things that we do see here at Stanford is we do see students embracing a kind of muscular Christianity that I don't think we've seen out and about on campus since maybe the 1950s.
Right. Well, Fred, I thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Ian. Thanks for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Fred Turner, the Harry and Norma Chandler Professor of Communications at Stanford University. He's the author or co-author of 5 books, including Seeing Silicon Valley, Life Inside of Fraying America, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, Stuart Brand, The Whole Earth Network, and The Rise of Digital Utopianism. And he has an article at the Baffler, The Texas Ideology, Silicon Valley Looks for Lebensraum in the Bible Belt. We're going to take a brief station break and back, assessing a new poll that finds GOP voters are most likely to call Trump tough, intelligent, or a peacemaker while Democrats and independents say he's destructive, erratic, or reckless.
President Joe once had a dream. The world held his hand, gave their pledge, so he told them his scheme for a savior machine. They called it the prayer, its answer was law. Its logic stopped war, gave them food, how they adored, till it cried in its boredom.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Jonathan Geyer, a program director at the Institute for Global Affairs at the Eurasia Group, a reporter and editor focused on foreign policy, national security, and the Middle East. He is an Arabic and Hebrew speaker and spent 5 years as a correspondent in Egypt. He is the regular contributor at The New Republic, The New York Magazine, The Guardian, among others, and the co-author of a new study at the Eurasia Group, Reckless Peacemaker, How Americans See Trump's Foreign Policy. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jonathan Geyer.
Thank you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Jonathan. And your new study was conducted last month between October 6th and 14th, right? And which was a pretty busy time for the news.
Yeah, I mean, kind of dizzying news cycle as ever. But yeah, we did a poll of 1,000 Americans trying to understand how they perceive President Trump's foreign policy. And that's where we got this kind of evocative title, Reckless Peacemaker, because it's super partisan. Republicans are very likely to call President Trump a peacemaker, and Democrats are very likely to call him reckless or destructive. So we wanted to get to that kind of anomalous perception of the president, whereby there's such polarization in this country, especially in foreign policy, that we have something like half of Democrats think Israel is conducting a genocide in Gaza, whereas Republicans see that entirely differently. And these partisan divides, I think, are maybe the main story on Trump's foreign policy. But then there are some moments of overlap that are, I think, quite compelling. Thinking about these strikes in the Caribbean and all this saber rattling on Venezuela and Nigeria, what we found is that 3/4 of Americans think that any military operations the president does overseas, that should have congressional authorization. So that's 74% of Americans want Congress to play a bigger role in military stuff overseas. And obviously that's in the Constitution, but we don't often think of Congress having that kind of role in exercising its war powers. So that's just among the findings. We also polled on the military budget and whether whether folks in America think Trump deserves a Nobel Prize. Not very many. But yeah, it's a snapshot of a kind of crazy moment in early October where the Gaza ceasefire was coming into fruition, where the government shutdown started, but it also gives a kind of bigger picture of how Americans, who most people don't think Americans think a lot about foreign policy, but there are a lot of issues where foreign policy does play a role in our lives.
Well, one of the more revealing aspects of your poll on the Middle East, particularly on Gaza, was that 29% of Americans think the U.S. should stop supporting Israel's military campaign. And among Gen Z, it was 43%. That's pretty
Exactly.
interesting.
Yeah, no, the Gen Z divides, I think, are a major storyline and show a lot of opportunity for changing policies for the next Democratic administration, how Democrats in Congress might approach the Trump administration. I think there's also a lot of wariness towards how President Trump is dealing with China. There's just not a lot of approval rating for how China policy has gone so far. We picked 13 kind of key foreign policy issues. That's where he rated among the lowest, below climate change, below foreign trade. So yeah, the performance rating on foreign policy is not doing so great for Mr. Trump.
But what about Americans' feelings about Trump's assault on democracy? Because he's intensifying. He's only been in office 9 months, and he's moved faster than Putin did. It took Putin several years to completely control the press and essentially create a police state. Now, you can argue whether Trump that's Trump's intention. But there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that it is, that he's modeling himself on Orban in Hungary, which he just hosted in the White House. So is there anything on that, or is that not?
Absolutely.
Where does that
No.
stand in contrast to other issues? You would think it would be front and center.
Well, I think it is for Democrats. I think we're seeing that partisan divide here too. So more than half of Democrats, like 51%, think Democratic decline is a big deal, is a huge concern, but only 8% of Republicans. So it's Republicans are more alarmed by crime. But both Democrats and Republicans are concerned about political unrest in this country. I mean, you can imagine how each might interpret what political unrest means and who's causing that unrest. But I do think the kind of questions about the US as a democracy are truly front and center for Democrats. And probably a lot of your listeners in the Bay Area and elsewhere share those concerns. And I wonder if, that's something that Democrats might capitalize in this period.
Well, polls find that Republicans, at least 47% of them, think Trump is intelligent. And that definitely is not the way Democrats and independents see him. What do you think?
Exactly.
Where does that come from, do you think? Is it because of the siloed information that we have, where they just getting everything from Fox News and other sources, right-wing sources like
I'm
Newsmax?
yeah, I
What
mean
explains that? Because that's not the first thing that comes to mind when I think about Donald Trump, that he's
no,
intelligent.
the splits there are kind of unreal. It's something like 5% of Democrats would call Trump intelligent, and as you say, almost half of Republicans. And what we did is we offered respondents about 13 traits: reckless, destructive, tough, peacemaker. And the splits are pretty stunning. There's not a whole lot where people agree on how they perceive President Trump. I can't exactly explain why people might call him intelligent. But it is interesting that tough is one that is sort of incongruous for being a tough peacemaker. It seems like kind of two words you wouldn't necessarily think go together. Um, one area where people don't think is he's a warmonger. Very few people, about 5% overall, would call Trump a warmonger. Now, of course, there have been some issues where, like we've talked about this before, Ian, the strikes on Iran that the US participated in with Israel, other bombing campaigns in Yemen. There are instances where Trump has pursued military operations rather than diplomacy, but that hasn't really broken through.
So the stark contrast is that Republicans think Trump is tough, intelligence, or a peacemaker, but Democrats and independents say he's destructive, erratic, or reckless. So they're quite a contrast.
Yeah, and I think this gets to some really big questions about how much public opinion actually plays, what the role of public opinion is in foreign policy. I mean, this tends to be an elite game. There are such huge gaps between what the public cares about, what elites in Washington care about, and how this president sort of he is independent. He does do his own thing. Of course, there are, lobbyists and influential voices that have his ear. But at the end of the day, the public doesn't tend to have a big role in foreign policy, which is why my organization does this annual survey to get a real temperature check on what people think about Iran, Ukraine, Gaza, and so forth. Because to my mind, the more that people's voices are involved in foreign policy making, maybe the U.S. could have a bit of a more efficient or a more grounded foreign policy and approach to the world.
But given that a lot of Trump supporters are leery of foreign interventions and particularly were concerned about Iran, which is, I think, is
Mhm.
why Trump made it a very short and swift intervention and made it really clear that there was an end date. How do they feel about Venezuela? Because you have the fact that most Americans, or a lot of Americans, like Trump's focus on international drug trafficking. I don't know how they feel about blowing up these drug boats, but in general, it seems that Trump is using the drug issue as a way to get into a war with Venezuela.
Exactly. This was a surprisingly popular area, according to our survey of Trump's foreign policy, is I think because the drug issue is felt so viscerally in America, many Americans know someone who has been affected by fentanyl or other drug issues, it's actually quite popular, which is somewhat incongruous because, as I said, 3/4 of Americans don't think the US should be taking military action overseas without Congress, but they're pretty supportive of, uh, targeting drug cartels. And we put this survey in the field before this Venezuela fear mongering had really taken shape. I mean, this is again sort of what we know about the Trump news cycle is he really changes priorities week to week. And in early October it was Mexico. Now we're focused on Venezuela. Who knows if this will be just another node in a set of crises that the president seems to capitalize on. But there is something interesting about the foreign policy issues that resonate most at home: immigration, drug trafficking, and so forth, and the ones that don't tend to focus that much attention on Americans.
Well, it's interesting that so much of the sort of top people in Trump's Pentagon, like Elbridge Colby, who's very influential, are really obsessed about China and want to focus on China as the next big threat. But your poll, Jonathan, seems to indicate that competition with China is way down at the bottom of the list.
Right, exactly. You would think this would be a real top priority. And we also asked Americans, if Taiwan were attacked, do you think the US should jump in and defend it? And there's not that much support for that. We also polled a couple other countries, Poland and Israel, whether Americans would want the US to defend them should they be attacked. Um, Fewer than half of Americans want that. So, yeah, it's hard to know the extent to which these elite opinion shapers like Mr. Colby, how they reach Americans. But yeah, China competition, incredibly ubiquitous in Washington, but not necessarily the top threat Americans think about. When you look at Gen Z, they're really worried about gun violence. Americans often talk about immigration, rightly or wrongly, as a top concern.
But back to the issue of Trump assaulting our democracy and accruing massive executive power. We basically, one branch of the government, at least half of the legislative branch, the House of Representatives, has literally been out of business for 7 weeks, essentially to protect Trump from the Epstein files.
Right.
It's just extraordinary how they've capitulated and given him enormous power. So, how much focus is there amongst the American people on how Trump is reshaping the presidency and centralizing executive power?
Well, first, let me say, Ian, that Congress is really unpopular. We polled about a bunch of different institutions, the military, intelligence agencies, even ICE, and ICE is more popular than Congress. So people do not like Congress. And I do wonder if that's because they really are not doing enough to rein in some of these presidential overreach. But I think to your bigger question, to your bigger point on the presidency, I mean, I think many people thought President Trump would grow into the presidency, and that just really hasn't happened. What we've seen is the president is redefining how powers are used, how military and institutions are currying favor with Trump and so forth. And I think what that leaves us with is the presidency is going to be totally different than when he started back in 2017. And that's kind of a much bigger reckoning than any of us may have imagined.
Well, your poll took place before Trump tore down the East Wing, so I guess you don't have anything on that. But I have a feeling, and I personally found it absolutely revolting what he's done, and it's going to be even worse because this great white elephant that will distort the White House forever is going to be haunting us for decades unless it's stopped or torn down. So I guess it's hard to poll on that because the poll took place before he did that. But do you have any inkling of how the American public feel about Trump's basically tearing down the White House, tearing down the Rose Garden, redecorating the Lincoln bedroom, etc.?
Well, and all the nice gold lettering, kind of labeling all of these things in case we didn't know it was the Oval Office. No, I mean, we didn't pull on that. We're focused on how American statecraft and diplomacy might lead to better outcomes. And the truth is that what the American people think is the president is making things worse on a whole lot of issues, not better. And I think a lot of this does have to do with, as you say, this imperial presidency, this kind of expansion of powers that is really frightening, that doesn't have any checks or balances, and is leading to situations where militarism tends to be a outcome of first resort. Now, I do think one area that's somewhat positive is the military budget. Americans are starting to recognize that a bigger military budget may not make us safer, and I think that's a good thing. But at the end of the day, the concerns about the expansion of powers in this White House definitely are concerning, and I think are playing out on a whole host of foreign policy issues.
So, just in the last minute or so, then, do you think that there's any sense of what might succeed Trump and how that would be? I mean, at this moment, Democrats, a lot of them are mad at Chuck Schumer. So you got a little bit of fratricide going on the Democratic side, which certainly is not helpful if they want to take over from the Republicans. But on the Republican side, I'm wondering about any kind of realization about Trump losing it and having the vice president step in. I don't think he has.
Yeah.
I don't think he has anything like the cult following that Trump has.
No, and his approval rating isn't as high as Trump's. We did ask about Vice President Vance, and 45% of Americans say he's doing a poor job so far. 35% of Americans say Marco Rubio's doing a poor job, and Americans aren't as familiar as Pete Hegseth or Tulsi Gabbard and their role, according to our survey. But yeah, it's unclear who follows Trump, and it's unclear if Congress is gonna take a more robust stance in stopping some of this militarism abroad. But I do think one thing that is important is just bringing in American voices into the conversation who aren't just in Washington, and trying to widen that scope so that U.S. foreign policy has more ideas from outside of the Beltway.
Well, Jonathan, I thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate the work you've done.
Thanks so much.
And again, I've been speaking with Jonathan Geyer, who's the Program Director at the Institute for Global Affairs at the Eurasia Group, a reporter and editor focused on foreign policy, national security, and the Middle East. He is an Arabic and Hebrew speaker and spent 5 years as a correspondent in Egypt. He's a regular contributor to The New Republic, New York Magazine, The Guardian, among others, and the co-author of a new study at the Eurasia Group, Reckless Peacemaker, How Americans See Trump's Foreign Policy. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Sasha Linden Cohen, and Asher Price. If you missed any of today's program or would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on those platforms. Find us on Twitter and Facebook, as well as also now on Blue Sky at Ian Masters Media. And please do help us reach more listeners by sharing the program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help us sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing, and I'm always available at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
The guy that lived next door in 305